Okay, we're starting recording. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Kerr. I'm with the Maryland Department of the Environment in their Waste Diversion Division. And one of my duties here is to implement a new food diversion law that Maryland passed in 2021. As part of that law, any large food generators in the state who are within 30 miles of a organics recycling facility uh, are required to divert their food from final disposal in a landfill or in a incinerator. And as part of that law, some of the organic recycling resources that we are looking at are composting and anaerobic digestion, and that is the topic of today's discussion. Uh, Before we get started, I just want to direct people to the MDE website if you would like to learn more about the law and more about food diversion in the state. There is a webpage on MDE. It's called Food Residuals. And on that site, there's plenty of resources. There's plenty of information about the problem with food waste. There's information on different companies in Maryland who deal with food waste, both the hauling and the processing. There's information on what schools can do. There's plenty of guides for individuals and organizations to use to follow to try to deal with this problem of food waste. And it is a problem that is contributing to climate change, contributing to filling up landfills and a lot of other problems with as far as not providing food for people in need who might need that food instead of having it discarded. So today we have two great speakers. We have Brenda Platt, who's with the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, and she's going to be talking about composting and the work they do there for composting. And we have Dr. Stephanie Lansing from the University of Maryland, who does a lot of work with anaerobic digesters. And so we're going to hear a little bit about what anaerobic digestion is all about and how that can be used as well for organic recycling. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce Brenda Platt. Brenda directs the Composting for Community initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. It's a national nonprofit where she's worked for 37 years. Her current focus is advancing distributed composting that encompasses composting at homes, community gardens, farms, and other venues. She's lived in Maryland since 1989 and actively supports composting programs and policies in the state that maximize local economic and environmental benefits. So thank you for being here, Brenda, and take it away.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for inviting me to participate today and for all of you for joining us. So Tim asked me to give an introduction to composting and with a spotlight on Maryland and some of the policy work we've been doing. But before I get started, I just wanted to just so we're all on the same page here about what compost is and what composting means. So compost is a living soil amendment, but it's not soil. It's a soil enhancer, and it's full of stable plant available nutrients, and it's rich in organic matter. I like to call it black gold. You're basically, as this image shows, taking rotting food and green waste, yard trimmings, and turning it into that kind of black gold that you see on the bottom right there of the planet Earth. But one thing I'll just say is it's a biological process, like Stephanie will talk about with anaerobic digestion. And with composting, if we control certain conditions, the materials are going to decompose faster. So it has many soil benefits: soil fertility, suppresses plant diseases, stimulates root growth, improves something called cation exchange capacity, which is the ability of soil to retain nutrients. It helps soil retain water, which can be really important when we are facing drought conditions, and even when we have stormwater events, it can help prevent a loss of soil and soil erosion. So it's adding organic matter to soil is really important. Another driver for composting, of course, is reducing your trash and what you set out at the curb every week. 21% is food scraps alone. So we have a tremendous opportunity to do more recycling of this organic material. There's also a lot of climate benefits. We did this poster. This is actually a long poster, but I kind of cut into two so it would fit on this slide. But when food scraps end up in a landfill, they contribute to methane emissions, which is a very highly potent greenhouse gas. Incinerators also produce climate and other pollutants. So we need to reduce both incineration and landfilling in the state. But when you add that black gold to soil, that you're enhancing the ability of soil to act as a, a carbon sink, and soil will sequester more carbon when you're storing that carbon in the soil. So really important for climate protection. There's a report that EPA issued recently quantifying methane emissions from landfilled food waste, and that found evidence that wasted food causes 58% of methane emissions from municipal solid waste landfills. And there was a recent report in Maryland that indicated that Maryland landfills were emitting more methane than previously thought. So we have a lot of work to do in Maryland to stem the flow of food waste to incinerators and landfills. And it kind of comes down to, I think, do you want it going up in smoke in an incinerator stack or in a landfill, or do you want to produce that black gold that can go back into soils to grow food? So I'll let you ponder that question. We produced at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance this hierarchy of strategies to reduce food waste and what we call grow community. And of course, we want to prevent unnecessary food scraps. We want to rescue food that's edible, both for people and then for livestock. People first, of course. But then what this graphic shows is just how important it is to keep the organics material recycling locally within local communities. If you can do it in your backyard, home composting is really important. Then we promote small scale decentralized. And by the way, this can be composting or anaerobic digestion. There are different scales for all of these when it comes to composting or AD. So you can do small scale decentralized, farm scale for both, and you can do centralized. And we think most preferred is up here. We want to reduce waste, rescue food, home composting, small scale. And I'll get into why that's important. But this is just kind of showing that small scale decentralized is where community composters can accept material from off-site or simply process their own material. Medium scale could be farm scale. It could be an institution like a university or a college. There's many around the country that are doing this. And we at the Institute are really promoting infrastructure that's local and decentralized and diverse. We're seeing some trends that promote large-scale industrial sites and privileging those sites. And I think that's what it comes down to. We really want to have a healthy infrastructure. When it comes to community composting, which is basically the not so radical idea that we can produce and use compost within the same communities that the food scraps are generated and the community is engaged in some way, we're seeing a lot more benefits when that happens. So keeping operations local helps ensure that the community reaps the economic, environmental, and social benefits. And why does it matter? Well, again, it's just circling these nutrients back into the local economy. You may be familiar with farm to table, but here we're talking about table back to farm or back into the soil. So it's a closed loop. We worked with the US EPA last year. They just launched this pretty recent new website on community composting, and there's some videos there that we helped produce and help design this graphic. But this graphic kind of shows the three arms, if you will, with the three stems, I should say, of the social, environmental, and economic benefits. So on the social, you've got community empowerment, you've got youth education, food security, revitalized neighborhoods. Environmental is reduced pollution, healthier soils, climate resiliency, less trash. And on the economic, we're creating more jobs through composting. When it's local, you're having more businesses, so there's more innovation. And of course, farm prosperity is really important. Community composters are growing across the country. We convene this national coalition. We have 329 organizational members in 43 states and a handful of other countries. And this chart just shows, we did a census last year. So for every 10,000 tons of materials flowing to an incinerator, you may create one job. Maybe it's at best 2 jobs in a landfill. But when it goes through community composting, when it's local, you're creating 6 jobs per ton. In comparison. And I don't know, Stephanie, if you have any figures on anaerobic digestion, but I would love to see that put up here too. I mentioned this disturbing trend for consolidation. The industry is that managing waste in the U.S. is anywhere from $80 to $90 billion industry, and over 50% of what goes into landfills in this country is controlled by just 3 companies: Waste Management, Republic Services, and Waste Connections. But even some of these smaller ones, like Casella Waste, which is a dominant force in New England and particularly in Vermont, they are now buying out and expanding into the Mid-Atlantic. They paid $500 million last year to acquire GFL in the Mid-Atlantic a year ago. So we're going to be seeing more concentration in our area. And you may say, well, what's the big deal when big trash corporations, are consolidating their across services? And it really is a big deal, because then not only do they own the collection routes and the right to haul and the landfills, but they also maximize profits through fees at each stage. And they create this landscape where they're paid basically to remove the economic and environmental benefits from communities, and they use those profits to gain more industry control. So democracy is not just political, it's also economic. We have a podcast that talks about how the trend towards large scale is harming farmers and community composters. So feel free to check that out on our, you can just Google ILSR and our Composting for Community podcast, and you'll probably find that. But one of the beauties of composting is that it can be small scale and large scale, and literally everything in between. And I'm going to show you some examples. These are pretty popular at community gardens and schools, but there's multi-bin systems. Composting, by the way, is aerobic, which distinguishes it from anaerobic digestion, which is starved oxygen. So in all these pictures, I want you to notice how the oxygen is getting into the pile. This is a blower at a horse farm, but here's volunteers with their pitchfork getting the air in the pile. There's a whole variety of in-vessel systems, which are basically mean that composting is enclosed, but the air is coming in through some way, and it's being turned and coming out the other end. Aerated static piles have blowers basically blowing air through or pulling air out through the pile. And these are farm scale, and at community farms, we even see these at community gardens too. Bay and bunker systems are similar, where some of these can have pipes underneath, or could be simply a skid steer turning the pile from one bunker to the other. These are very common on farm operations. Windrow systems, these are very common in Maryland, and farmers use these a lot. They're really elongated windrows or piles, and a tractor turning this auger that aerates the pile. So this is a Maryland farmer. And there's many do-it-yourself options. So this is at EcoCity Farms, is repurposed shipping containers with solar-powered blowers. This is the back of it, and that's in Bladensburg, Maryland. But even when it comes to home composting, there's many different systems out there, fully enclosed systems or ones you can make out of pallets. If you're in an area where there's what I call a lot of rodent pressure, where there's rats in your area, we do recommend something that's more enclosed to help prevent rodents from getting in there. And if you have no or little yard, or you live in an apartment, you have the option of worm composting. And if you're wondering how to do this, I'm going to show you a link to some YouTube videos, but I'm not going into the basics of hot composting or worm composting today, except to share with you that for hot composting, you basically need these 4 ingredients. You need brown materials, which are like woody materials, wood chips, leaves. Greens might be your fruit scraps or grass clippings. You need oxygen, as I mentioned before, and you need moisture. Those microbes cannot survive without moisture. We have a lot of resources on home composting. what to include, like here, the signage, what not to include. At drop-off sites, we have sample signage, we have an online course, we have the podcast I mentioned, and if you're interested in home composting, we have, in the recent months, just posted a series of short videos on how to hot compost, and these are also available in Spanish. So if you go to our website, ilsr.org, home-composting, you will find those. And then if you're more interested in planning your own composting site or community compost or getting involved, you're involved in a garden and you want to add composting, we have some resources for that. One of the first tips we say is take a training course, decide who your partners are. But listen, if you're not going to start composting, you're not interested, you can exercise your civic power to advocate for good policies and programs. So push your local planners, your elected officials, your Tim Cares at your state agencies to adopt good programming and planning. They can provide at the local and state level technical assistance and training, and hopefully support reasonable policies and regulations, from procuring finished composting to contracting with micro haulers and processors. And there's so much more. Tim asked me to talk a little bit about policy, so I'm just going to wrap up with just sharing a few slides on policy in Maryland, and just also nationally. My colleague Julia Spector, who's participating today, put this action plan guide with our also colleague Naji Kwaji. And so if you're got a local community and they're working on a climate action plan, we have some model language here of what you can include. We have a new composting policy resource hub that we just posted. It's ilsr.org's composting-policy, and that has tools for local action. We have climate change, we have how to promote healthy soils, on-farm composting policies, zero waste policies, so check those out. They're state and local as well as federal, and these are just some examples: zoning and permitting, infrastructure, soil health. We used to say in the recycling field, if you're not buying recycled content products, closing that loop, you're not completely recycling, and the same is true for composting. If you're not using compost, you're not completely closing that loop, so use compost. And I'll just end with just some strong points on that. Farmers want to compost in Maryland and they want to use compost, and we do need some um, uh, we do need strong policies and rules in Maryland. We've already got some new permitting pathways in Maryland. The state will be providing some more guidelines. There was a bill that passed last year that expanded the permit exemption for farmers, so the guidelines will be released soon. There'll be a public comment period. Maybe Tim will talk more about that or mention it, but we really emphasize that policies should support clean feedstocks and keep out contaminants. And we want to see more demonstration sites and financial support. Over the years, the Institute has been heavily involved in promoting good policy in Maryland. Don't worry, I'm not going to read you this list, but just starting in 2011, we've been very much involved in helping to develop compost regulations and policies. And the bill I mentioned for on-farm composting passed in 2023. And there was a grant program to help schools reduce wasted food. Unfortunately, that the funding got stripped out of that, but there's been a bill that we've been working on for 3 years now that would create a huge funding program to support not only the school program, but on farmers composting more, and how to and as well as 48% of that grant fund would go to food reduction and diversion grant programs. I think the bill is passing. It's 1318 through, but the last day of session is Monday, so we'll see where it ends up. But the funding mechanism, unfortunately, was stripped out of it. That would have established a $2 per ton surcharge on waste disposed in the state, which would have created $14 million to fund the grant program. So we'll have to come back next year and fight for that. And so this is my last slide to just say that hopefully we'll learn from the recycling field to keep our organics and food scraps clean. The commingling of recyclables in one container really didn't help markets for recyclables in this country. I'd probably need another webinar to talk about that. But really, I just want to end with, let's keep food scraps clean, be wary of food packaging, depackagers, and let's make sure that our policies support composting of all sizes and that we don't privilege dominant corporations and just large industrial sites. I will
Mm-hmm.
stop presenting and hand it back to you now, Tim.
Thanks, Brenda. That was great. What is the objection to depackagers? Is it just the plastic that gets caught up into the material? Is that the main concern?
Yeah, a lot of wasted food is packaged, and there is
Yeah.
going to be, I think, an important role for depackagers. What they are is machines that get installed in the front end of a large digester or a large composting site, and they rip apart packaged goods. But what we're seeing is it's how they're being implemented. So in New England, where the laws to require large food waste generators to
Mhm.
not dispose of their food waste, there's systems that have been built that say, oh, you don't need to separate your food scraps anymore. Commingle all the packaged stuff with everything, put it in one bin. Don't worry, we're sending it to a depackager.
Yeah.
Well, yes, there's concerns about plastics and microplastics and contaminants. So let's save the depackagers for just the packaged food and
Yeah.
keep the other stuff separate. So that's where we are on that.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there's three main players nationwide in the composting business, I guess you could say. A lot of municipalities and cities, ideally, New York City has done it, are making curbside or bin food collection spots available to their citizens. Is there a danger that if these cities sign, let's say, contracts with some of those three companies that you mentioned, that it could strangle out some of the local composters and some of the local haulers who were doing business before the city did curbside for everybody?
Yeah,
If you know what
absolutely.
I
I mean,
mean.
yeah. So I think if you're a local government, think about how you can exercise your contract. You have so much power with your contracting authority. So are you going to require universal recycling and that all the haulers have to offer trash recycling and organics? Or are you going to establish a contracting system where you're going to help hire a variety of food scrap collection providers and composters? And we think the latter is healthier for cities. For keep
Yeah.
the materials circulating within local economies and regions as well as the dollars. So Falls Church in Virginia, which is in our region, they contract with veteran compost, they contract with compost crew for festivals, drop off, and curbside. DC's pilot program is now working with Compost Crew and Compost Cab for the pilot. So there are some good examples of how local
Mhm.
governments have kind of diversified their portfolio, if you will.
Yeah. And the on-farm composting is in the regulation writing stage right now, or review stage. So we should have information on public comment period coming up. So keep an eye out for that, everybody. Okay, let's thank you, Brenda, very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Stephanie Lansing. She's a professor and associate chair in the Department of Environmental Science and Technology at the University of Maryland. She leads the Bioenergy and Bioprocessing Technology Laboratory there. Her research focuses on anaerobic digestion. She's had 20 years of experience in renewable energy research, outreach education, and economic and sustainability analysis of waste to energy systems. So, Dr. Lansing, thank you, and I'll throw it over to you. You're on mute.
There you go.
There
Okay.
you go.
Wonderful. So, thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk about using food waste in anaerobic digestion systems. So I'll give an overview of anaerobic digestion basics, talk about different food waste categories and how that food waste and those food waste residuals can go into digesters. Talk about a case study in Maryland, a Kilby Farm digester, and finally address food waste digestion policy. So anaerobic digestion just can take any type of waste. We have in at the University of Maryland, when I flush my toilet, my waste goes to the DC wastewater treatment plant, and there the sewage sludge is digested to help, which produces electricity to run the waste plant. We have animal farm digesters, so the manure from instead of being an open air lagoon, that can go inside of a digester and produce energy. We can put food scraps in there as well as agricultural waste, and we're going to focus again on the food scraps today. What comes out of the digester, they're natural microorganisms, the same microorganisms you have in your stomach that digest your food is exactly what happens inside a digester. They're natural organisms that take the waste, so take the food from the broccoli, break it down into very small parts, into carbohydrates, sugars, and then finally into very short chain carbons that methanogens, which we also have in our guts, use to produce biogas. And so that biogas can be burned directly for heat. We have small scale digesters in Haiti or Costa Rica that I've worked with, in Africa, that use that for their cooking and heating needs. You can also scrub out the hydrogen sulfide, which is, again, just a byproduct of sulfur being there. It's produced naturally as well. If you ever step into a wetland and it smells kind of like rotten eggs, that's the hydrogen sulfide that's naturally produced. So you can scrub that out and then produce electricity. That's renewable energy. Or you can scrub that out as well as the CO2 that's there and produce renewable natural gas. And to be clear, the CO2 that's released when we use it for heat or electricity, that's the same CO2 that was brought into the plant, for example, during photosynthesis. Just like when we eat that plant and breathe out CO2, it's not additional CO2. It's the same CO2 that came through for photosynthesis. And what this digester allows us to do is take that piece of broccoli. By putting it into a digester, we actually have it in the form of the nutrients that can be used for plant growth. So we can separate the solids out and use the solids directly as a compost-like fertilizer, a soil amendment, or we can put the whole liquid stream on the fields for digestate. So just like we use animal manure for a liquid fertilizer, you can do the same thing after digestion. The benefits being all of the odors have been captured. And so it's a much more pleasant digestate to use as a fertilizer source. So the benefits are anaerobic digestion is it's non-intermittent renewable energy. So that means whether the sun is shining or the wind is blowing, it's 24 hours a day, just like our stomachs work 24 hours a day. And it's really, it has a lot of different ways you can use the output. You can use it for heat. You can use it for electricity. You can upgrade to renewable natural gas. And if we do use it for electricity, not only do we get the electricity, but the waste heat, what they call combined heat and power, we can actually capture that waste heat and use that as well. So you can use it in many different ways. It reduces methanes and CO2 emissions that would be released into the atmosphere. So if we have an open manure lagoon, that methane is going into the atmosphere, whether it's for 2 cows or 200 cows. If we have a landfill, that, again, they try to capture some of that methane in some landfill capture systems, but a lot of that is escaping into the atmosphere. So by having it in a digester, we're actually able to extract and utilize that for energy production. And it also processes food waste and produces power from this waste that would go to landfill and allows the nutrients in that waste to be recycled to grow more food. So anaerobic digestion really can be integral to a biocircular economy. It uses these natural bacteria to reduce fossil fuel use and chemical fertilizer use, reduces greenhouse gases. When we think about a biocircular economy, we want to minimize the effects of climate change and also minimize food loss and waste. And it's also integral in that. But it really is for spoiled food that can't be repurposed that should go to digestion or composting. So the EPA wasted fuel scale, I just wanted to talk about this for a minute. This is a new food scale that they put out, kind of replaces the pyramid they had before, and digestion is listed twice. So there's a little bit of confusion that may cause. But what that really means is when we're talking about preventing food waste, the best thing to do is to prevent it, to donate it, recycle it, to feed animals or leave it unharvested in the field as a soil amendment, or to further process it from composting or anaerobic digestion with the effluent, the digestate or the compost itself being used on the field for fertilizer. So those are really the best use. If you do anaerobic digestion, let's say at a wastewater treatment plant, instead of those biosolids going onto the fields, let's say you landfill those biosolids or incinerate those biosolids, and you're not actually using the effluent as a nutrient, it's not completing that cycle, then it's least preferred. Or if you're just applying the food directly to the land without composting or digesting, it's least preferred. So that's why anaerobic digestion is listed twice. If we're using it as part of the biocircular economy and putting the nutrients back onto the field, then we have it, the EPA has it as equal to compost. If we are not putting those nutrients back onto the field and we're disposing of the biosolids, then they have it equal as applying to the land, which is less preferable, but more preferable than taking it to the landfill, the food waste. So when we're thinking about anaerobic digestion, you need to think about the food waste categories. What type of food waste can you put into your digester? So a lot of digesters in Maryland, for example, and Pennsylvania and other places have food processing residuals put into the digester. The reason, I'll go through kind of what that is, but this is something that can't be, this is from a poultry processing plant, from a, making fish sticks, making Smucker's ice cream, jelly, anywhere these residuals really aren't safe for feeding people, but they definitely have the nutrients and they're safe to put back on the fields, just like we put manure back on the fields, and we really want to recycle those, as well as on-farm processing waste. So if we're making milk, there might be some residuals from that we can put into a digester. We can also, as Brenda mentioned, packaged food that can go into digestion or composting, assuming that we depackage it correctly. Or if there's any crop waste, that can also go back into a digester. And that's all considered pre-consumer waste. So it hasn't actually gone on the plates of a consumer, versus post-consumer waste is going to be that prepared food placed on a consumer's plates from a restaurant, from your household. So often we get more pre-consumer waste in digesters just because there isn't much other place to put it, as well as it's usually very consistent. You can also put post-consumer waste into a digester, but with post-consumer waste, we just need to worry about contamination. And when we're talking about contamination, I'm not talking about chemical contamination. I'm actually talking about the metal fork and the rubber bands and the ketchup packet that's with your chicken nuggets. It just makes it more difficult to process, but they can be processed in the same way through digesters. You just need to understand the consistency of your feedstock if you're using food waste residuals in a digester. So specifically on dissolved air flotation, I know there was bills this year in the Maryland legislature talking about food waste residuals. So food waste residuals is a large category. Some of those residuals are actually processed through a waste treatment process called dissolved air flotation. So when we talk about DAF, dissolved air flotation, it can come from a lot of different processing. And what it is after let's say it's a poultry plant, after the poultry plant, we'll take kind of the bones, the chicken pieces, the feathers, any of that stuff actually goes to rendering. So that's not even part of it. That all goes for dog food or for other kind of rendering. And then it's the liquid stream that's left over. And that liquid stream, we actually add a lot of oxygen to it. So it actually aerates, so it shouldn't smell at that point. And we add a coagulant like they do in a wastewater treatment plant, so like an iron. And it brings all the carbohydrates, the fats, the proteins, it brings them to the surface, and then it's removed by mechanical spraying. And that's where all the good nutrients are. And so that part is DAF. That's the dissolved air flotation. It's dissolved material that come up that we scrape off. And that can be used for as in digesters, or it can be used to apply directly to fields. If it puts through the digester, then we eliminate the odors that are associated with it, because once that DAF sits around, it starts to decompose and then it starts to smell. So DAF is really this byproduct that contains nutrients that should be used to grow crops. And DAF is now in Maryland required to be digested or composted before it puts on the field, or it has to be injected if it hasn't been digested or composted, or it needs to be incorporated after it's field applied to help reduce odors. So when we think about biogas yields, this is the energy yield with food waste. So food waste and kind of skim grease. So DAF is kind of in the middle. It has some skim grease and it also is food waste, but it has a very large amount of biogas energy compared to cattle manure. Cattle manure has already been digested in the cow's stomach, but it's a source that if we don't digest it, then that methane goes into the atmosphere. So we often do digestate cattle manure, but if we add food waste to that digester, or if we do food waste on its own, we actually will get much more biogas because it hasn't already been digested in the cow's stomach. And it is higher than, let's say, grass or other things that are more hard to get at. The broccoli is pretty easy to digest and get that the energy out, as well as baking waste and other things can all be digested and produce energy. So I'm going to go through a case study. This is Kilby Farm in Cecil County, Maryland. It's a covered lagoon digester. So they had there's their original lagoon and they just put a cover over it to capture all that methane. It not only treats the manure from their dairy farm, but it also treats manure from cranberry processing. So this would be a food processing waste, DAF from poultry processing, so the dissolved air flotation, and it produces electricity with the biogas that's produced. So we did a 12-month study of the inputs and outputs of this farm digester to better understand what were the benefits of the digestion system. And so they have the food processing waste and the dairy manure going in. They actually solid separate the dairy manure before digestion, and the solids go directly to composting that are sold and put in kind of a fertilizer bag that you can get from, you know, a Home Depot or Lowe's or something. While the liquid manure goes into the digester and is added with this food processing waste. The effluent, after it's been digested, again, is odor-free, and they actually can then inject that because it's now a liquid stream. It's not the manure has been digested and liquefied. What they're able to do is they're able to power almost 200 homes per year, as well as their whole farm, with the 2,000 kilowatts of electricity that they produce each year. Because they're covering this manure and the methane's not going into the atmosphere, they're reducing 200 tons of CO2 per year, which is the same as taking 4,000 cars off the road with just this one system. And if we can look at the food waste, so this is the dairy manure down here. So this is actually the amount of energy that it can get per input that we put in over the 30 days of digestion. And what we can see is the manure is much lower at around 200. When we add the cranberry and the DAF, the dissolved air flotation from food processing, it's more than double at 600. So we've gone from 200 to 600. But when we put these two things together, we get much higher. We go to almost 1,000. That's because the dairy manure has a good buffering capacity and helps enhance the digestion of the food waste together. But you can do them separately. We can only have dairy digesters, only have food waste digesters, or we can mix them together. So if you're planning to do a digester for food waste, my advice is to start with the volume and the water content of the food waste, as this is going to affect the managing your outputs. So for example, if you've got, let's say, a soda waste, soda has a lot of sugar, it doesn't have a lot of nutrients, but also a lot of water. So how are you going to manage that versus having what is on someone's plate, the broccoli? While that broccoli doesn't have a lot of water at the beginning, after we digest it, the broccoli, just like it's digested in your stomach, gets liquefied. And so how are you going to manage that input? So really understanding the water volume and the total volume of your input. If you're co-digesting with manure, so you're on a farm, then you want to understand what's the extra nutrient management capacity. So for that farmer, the food waste that they add into their digester will be part of their approved nutrient management plan with the Maryland Department of Agriculture. So they need to understand if they have enough capacity on their fields to put that extra manure or the food waste that they're already the manure they're putting on their land. Now they're adding food waste. So what is the nutrient capacity of that? And do they have the capacity for that on their land? Also, how much fertilizer are they purchasing that they could offset by using this food waste instead? So it's less chemical fertilizer and the fossil fuels associated with that, as well as this food waste now can be used for their land. So understanding those, understanding their nutrient management, if you're thinking of co-digesting, is really important. And then also, will you install a solid separator? So for example, on Kilby Farm, they do a solid separation first. They compost that and they sell that off farm. Other farms, they actually digest all of the manure, the liquid and solid waste, and then they actually solid separate afterwards, and they use the solids for bedding for their cows. So that's something, again, they don't have to purchase, and then it just gets recycled through that stream. So digested solids can be used as a great bedding to reduce the resources that you're bringing on farm and the amount of materials you're bringing on. But it just depends on how you want to manage your system. So if you are using it as bedding, though, it needs to go through the digestion process to reduce all the pathogens before you have the cows sit on it. But it is a wonderful source of free bedding material after digestion. So this is an example of a digester in Massachusetts. It has 250 cows. And they have constructed a digester in 2016. And while they have smaller cows, only 250, it's a small farm. They have 9,000 tons of manure, but then they bring in a lot of food waste. And from that food waste, they're able to produce over 7,000 megawatts of electricity per year and reducing over 5,000 pounds of CO2 emissions daily. And they actually produce enough power for 1,600 homes due to the amount of waste that they're bringing in, and able to provide fertilizer for their fields as well. Now, if you are not a farmer, so you're a food waste only digester or a third-party digester, then you need to think about how you're going to treat the effluent that comes out. Are you going to field apply, or are you going to treat that water? What is the transport distance for that food waste? So if we think about composting actually, the water has a lot of evaporation. So you actually reduce the size of volume during composting. In digestion, we don't reduce volume because it's in a closed container. And so the volume that comes in is staying. It can't evaporate. The water doesn't evaporate with the extra heating like it does in composting. So what comes in is what's going to come out. So when we think about our broccoli coming in, we need to know how far we're going to transport that material if we're going to use it as a fertilizer. And are we going to separate the liquid and solids? So you need to think through these conditions, because again, as I said, they reduce solids and they create conditions for nutrient removal. So now that broccoli, I've digested it in my digester. I can now do solid liquid separation and sell that solids as a soil amendment. And then I can even do other processing like reverse osmosis or other screening to get even more nutrients out to sell. But then I still have that liquid stream. So I may be putting that into onto the fields. I may be treating it through a wastewater treatment plant, but the digesters don't reduce volume. So the volume in is the volume out. And so it may come in as a solid, but it'll go out the same volume with an increased moisture content. But it does allow for advanced processing to remove nutrients from broccoli so that you can actually use it as a fertilizer. In terms of Maryland policy, so as Tim mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Maryland did pass the Organics Recycling and Waste Diversion, requiring large food generators to separate food residuals to reduce food waste, donate edible food, divert to composting, or divert to anaerobic digestion or animal feed if there's a processor such as a digester capable of taking the waste within 30 miles. There is a current bill in this legislative session that's SB 808, Anaerobic Digestion Technology Coordination and Guidance, which is to really provide guidance to whether it's a farmer or a third-party vendor, whether it's small scale, in any type of digester, providing this with permit guidance, because there are different guidance you need if you're a third-party vendor, if you're food waste only, or if you're on a farm, it actually falls within different guidelines. So coordinating that is what this current legislation, providing the guidance for people interested in doing this. There's a lot of tools at the AgStar EPA website, and we also have a lot of tools on our website at the University of Maryland. But if you're interested in, I'm a farmer and I'm interested in bringing food waste, or I want to do a food waste only digestion, they have a lot of resources, as well as a tool where it's like a screening tool. So you can say, if I have this much food waste or this much manure or only food waste, and this is how big my digester is, what is the amount of renewable energy that I could produce, and what is the amount of greenhouse gases that I can reduce. So this is all developed by the EPA, and it will tell you all of that information, the amount of nutrients that'll come out, for fertilizer, the amount of fertilizer you'll offset, the amount of greenhouse gases you will offset, as well as your energy potential, depending on the feedstock mix that you have, as well as economic analysis tools as well. So I'm happy to take questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Langston. That was great. And if anybody does have any questions, they can either raise their hand on the emoji or type them into the, type them into the comment bar. With anaerobic digestion, Dr. Lansing, it seems like there's more of a recipe that would go into it than, like, for composting, you have your greens and your browns and whatnot. With an anaerobic digester, is it more technical as far as the amount of different material that you're going to put into the digester?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So like for composting, you want the carbon to nitrogen. So the greens and your browns are really your carbon nitrogen. You want that ratio because there's microorganisms that are using that. Digestion is a very similar process. So we also want the right carbon to nitrogen ratios because it's the same bugs. It's aerobic bugs for composting, anaerobic microbes for anaerobic digestion, but those bugs need that kind of ratio. The difference is we can deal with materials with very high moisture contents. Water in and water out is okay. With composting, we usually need drier because we don't want it to turn anaerobic. And if it has too much water in it, then it will turn anaerobic. And with composting, we want it to be drier and fluffier. We want the water evaporation to happen. So with digestion, we have a little bit more leeway in terms of the moisture content, but we also need it to be, the right mixture of carbon nitrogen. But luckily, usually food waste is usually pretty good, as well as manure already has, because we already do methanogenesis in our own guts, as well as in the cow guts. So it's something that's naturally occurring. So normally the food wastes that we put in and the manures have a pretty good ratio for us to use because, again, we're not as worried about the moisture content with digestion.
Right. And I'm sure we've all experienced upset stomachs before. Does that happen in anaerobic digesters?
Exactly. That's a really good analogy. So just like you want to add Tums to bring your pH a little bit higher, that's what you're adding calcium to kind of bring up. We can get that kind of acidification with digestion. And so we just want to manage the resources that come in. With manure digesters, we don't get it as much because manure have it's called a high alkalinity, but it just means it's a high buffering capacity. So I can add some of that acid and the manure helps me keep in that pH range of my healthy stomach. But when we have food waste only digesters, they are a little bit more prone to that. So all we do is we just make it consistent with the feed that we put in so that we keep them happy. What we don't want to do is it's kind of like our own upset stomach. So we have our digester and then all of a sudden I throw in all this sugar. And so I put that in, I put it all at one time, and then I get an upset stomach. And the same things happen with digesters. So that's why we often just have we're more managing the resources to add them in slowly so that we don't cause that upset stomach.
Yeah, it can be tricky sometimes when you eat the wrong thing, I suppose.
Yep, it's the same thing here. Yep, but we can eat a lot of different things in digesters.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different wastes that can go in and be broken down.
Great. And organic recycling is is a big there's a big trend for it, I guess you could say, nationwide, trying to deal with this problem of food waste and methane gases being released to the atmosphere. What are some of the issues, and Brenda, you can chime in here too, with composting and anaerobic digestion? What do you see as some of the issues that people raise as far as objecting to building these facilities nearby or or what are some of, I guess you could say, what are some of the misconceptions that people have about being
Yeah,
near
that's
or
what
living
really
near some of these things?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, if we think about like a food processing waste, whether it be a poultry processing waste or it could be a ice cream processing, it could be vegetable processing, any type of waste that's produced, that is just part of that processing, and that waste is still going to be produced if we have a digester on the end or not. And so, some of that waste is more in a liquid form. So, some can go to composting, and that's a great resource. Some of it really is too watery to go to composting. There's too much moisture. And so it's better fit for a digester. So it's really understanding the waste that we have. The waste isn't necessarily going to go away because, we have food processing facilities that allow us to have fish sticks. Take that invasive catfish that we're getting, process it into fish sticks. During that processing, there's going to be waste produced. And so it's just understanding that if we can find a way to utilize that waste, such as an anaerobic digester or composting, to provide a benefit back for society and complete that circular economy, digesters and composting are really important parts of that, because we want to get the nutrients and that waste back into our circular economy. When I've heard some opposition, it's often opposition to large agriculture, not necessarily opposition to the digesters themselves or to composting itself, which complete that cycle. And I think there's some misconceptions that digesters actually produce methane that wouldn't be there. So this whole idea, and the same thing with composting. Composting, during the degradation process, the microbes release the CO2, but that's the CO2 that came in for photosynthesis. It's not additionality. The same thing with digesters. When we use the biogas, we combust it from methane to CO2. So if we didn't have the digester, that methane from the landfill would go into the environment. The methane from the manure would go into the environment, which is much more impactful. By having it and using it and producing electricity from it, we convert it to CO2, but that's not new CO2. That's the CO2 that was taken up through photosynthesis. So there isn't an additionality associated with it. So I think a lot of the concerns are based on some misconceptions.
And with a digester, it's short-term CO2. It's not fossil fuels that are sequestered
It's not new
for millions
CO2.
of years.
Exactly. There's no additionality. It's the same CO2 that came in a few weeks ago during the photosynthesis process, or a few months ago. Go ahead, Brenda.
Yeah, I mean, Stephanie's spot on. And I'll just add that, if you're a home composter, a community scale, the first thing people think about when they're about composting is odors and rodents, right?
Yeah.
And so both of those things are definitely not a given. And as I mentioned before, composting, it's not rocket science. You do need to know a few things, but it's aerobic. If you're getting the oxygen in there, then it's when the pile goes anaerobic in the absence of oxygen that you're getting more smells. So if you take a short training, or you're setting yourself up for success and know just the basics, you shouldn't have nuisance odors. You shouldn't be attracting rodents. So the training that we offer, for home composters, we don't recommend meat and moldy things, bones and fish. Send that to your send that out somewhere else outside your backyard, unless you're a really experienced composter. Those things can be composted. They can be anaerobically digested. And one of the other, so that's kind of more on a local home scale, the perceived challenges and obstacles. One of the misconceptions that I'm hearing is people say, oh, anaerobic digestion is better than composting because it captures all the methane. Well, composting, if it's done right, doesn't really produce methane to begin with. So to hear these kind of, nonsense obstacles is so frustrating. So
right?
yeah, it's just, they're very different, and it does depend a lot on issues of scale and feedstocks, as Stephanie mentioned. If you have a really wet feedstock, AD digestion may be better. If you've got a lot of woody yard trimmings, you can use that to compost with your food scraps, and it makes a lot of sense.
Exactly.
Well, I'll second that, because I live in Baltimore City and I have a very small backyard, but I do compost in a tumbler. And I have seen rats running up and down the alley, but they've never bothered my tumbler. So I guess I'm doing something right. And
Yeah, I'll share a story that Compost Power in New York City, run by an amazing guy, Domingo Morales. He's got 8 compost sites in public housing in New York City, and he's getting credit from the New York City Public Housing Authority for driving out rodents out of
Oh,
those
really?
neighborhoods. And he's doing on-site composting, following best management practices, and connecting it with growing food in those communities. So it's circular, it's building community self-reliance,
Yeah,
and they are not creating rodent problems.
yeah.
The
It's
rodents
a lot
are
of
already,
misconceptions what
yeah,
people
the
call it.
rodents are already here in our cities
Yeah,
because we have open dumpsters and we're giving them a 24/7 buffet. That's why we have rat problems in our cities. It's not because we're starting to compost.
yeah.
And Stephanie, I think you nailed that. The wasted food is already here. Now,
Mhm.
what are we going to do about it, and what are the solutions we're going to implement to address this problem? And we can do it in a way that helps address food insecurity and builds community and creates jobs and supports our farmers in the state.
Mhm. They've got into my trash cans before, but not my not my compost.
There you go.
So, yeah, exactly. We have a few questions here. Jennifer, if you want to come off mute.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to say, we're down here in chicken industry, USA. And so there are a lot of odors that go along with that. The state of Maryland requires chicken farmers, to crust the houses and then let it sit in a building, basically, and then eventually take it back to the fields. But because of that, and because there's so much, sorry about that, so much agricultural waste in this area, people are very concerned about the smell. So a lot of people from this area or not from this area that move here have an issue with that. And then, of course, we have a DAP tank in the county that is really upsetting the folks that live in that end of town. It's stinking up the area so badly, these people can't go out of their houses. Yeah. They're getting annihilated with flies. I mean, the stink is horrible, and they already had a big, huge leak at that particular DAF tank. So there's actually legislation where they're going to prevent that sort of thing from happening in the county because it's been such a disaster. Now, we're unique in that we're the only Maryland landfill that actually, with the use of Ingenco, a company takes all our methane and converts it to electricity already. So we're kind of the odd man out in at least, Maryland landfills, in that we're already converting our methane to electricity. Working on trying to get composting going on in this area, but we really have there's a lot of pushback for that sort of thing. And while there are companies in Lower Delaware that are doing composting for the chicken industry, they're getting shut down left and right. So, it sounds great and wonderful on paper, but sometimes the logistics become a greater problem. And in our case, having all these crusted chicken houses, you already have people on edge about the smell. So it's going to be a hard sell in our area.
So I think, let me address that because I know we only have a minute left in the webinar. So thank you very much for that question. And so I think that an important part of composting and anaerobic digestion is that they do capture odors. So composting actually reduces odors. So if you compost the DAF material or food waste or other materials, that the odors, the aerobic process, the odors is actually is from the decomposition. In composting, that those odors are eliminated. The same thing with anaerobic digestion. There's odors produced inside the biogas, but it's all captured. So all of that DAF, if it was a DAF storage tank, instead of being a storage tank, if that was a digester, all of those odors would be inside the digester. And then just like when you turn on your stove, if it's a natural gas stove, there's an odorant added to it so that you can smell it. But you only smell that when it's in the atmosphere. As soon as you light your stove, it's ignited and gone. The same thing is with biogas. Biogas is odorous in itself, but it is completely 100% captured. And then once we utilize it, we actually destroy those odors. So digestion is a way to destroy odors from DAF by collecting it and utilizing it. And then composting is also a way to reduce odors, because with the aerobic process, the odors aren't produced in that aerobic atmosphere. So I think that there is solutions for this. And I would also say for landfilling from electricity, that's fine, but you're not getting the added benefits of being able to use those nutrient sources. So we really want the food waste to never go to it, because it's not an ideal not an ideal production process. And then that leachate is just, it can't be utilized back on the fields. And so we really want to reduce the food waste is really what's producing all of that methane that's producing electricity from the landfill. But we want to take that a step back from that, and we want to compost it or digest it so that those nutrients can go back onto the fields and complete the cycle. So landfill is still more of a linear way of thinking. And so we want to recycle this, and we want to use the waste like DAF in composting or digestion, because it does eliminate odors. So I think there's a misnomer that these technologies, that is what they do, is eliminate odors. That is one of the main benefits of both of these technologies. So I think it's a really good question.
And Jennifer, I can just share a very short story. There was a farm in Maryland that was composting dairy cow manure and applying it to the fields for years. And then the funding ran out, and they said, oh, we're not doing that anymore, just apply the manure. Well, within a few weeks, the complaints came in, and they said, okay, we're going to start composting again. So just as an example to underscore Stephanie's points.
All right. Very good. I appreciate all the questions that were put in. We've run out with a little bit over, but that's fine. I want to thank Dr. Lansing and Brenda from ILSR and from University of Maryland for attending and sharing with us their great information. If anybody else has any questions, or that you want to investigate this anymore, I put a link to the MDE website in the chat, and you can access that. Dr. Lansing has put a link in there as well, and Brenda has put one to ILSR in there as well. So I want to thank everybody. This recording will be posted sometime early next week, along with the other webinars we did this week. And I encourage everyone, if you want to review those, to enjoy them, take a look at them, and learn about all the organics recycling that we're trying to get done in Maryland. So I want to thank everybody, and take care and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.